Hello, students. So today we're going to be talking about masculinity in the 19th century South. We're going to be talking about masculinity in terms of white men as well as enslaved men. So we're going to cover a lot of different topics today, but the main ones that we're going to cover is first basic definitions, then we'll talk about traits of masculine identity for white men and for enslaved men. We'll talk about performances of manhood, appeals to manhood, and how Southern institutions kind of reinforced certain types of manhood in the South. So lots of different topics that we'll go over today, and by the end of it, you should have a better understanding of how important Southern masculinity was to the historical events of the South during the 19th century. So to begin, let's just start with some basic definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. So first, masculinity. Masculinity is defined as the traits, behaviors, and roles that characterize men. These traits, behaviors, and roles are defined by society and by society's expectations. So for example, in American society, we often hear the phrases, man up, or men don't cry, right? These kinds of phrases are associated with manhood because they emphasize the masculinity, the masculine traits of being independent, of being unemotional, that American society often expects of men, even though that is incredibly unrealistic, and we know that that is actually very toxic for American men themselves. But that's a definition of masculinity. It's traits, behaviors, and roles that characterize men as defined by society and society's expectations. Our second definition is masculine performance. Masculine performance is the public demonstration of that masculinity, of those traits, behaviors, or roles. So this might be, going off our previous example of men don't cry, this might be some men kind of hiding their emotions, kind of bringing it all in and not letting anyone know how they feel in the face of some horrible loss, right? That would be the performance of masculinity because they are performing that trait of being unemotional that American manhood contemporarily really emphasizes, right? Okay, our last definition is emasculation. This is when one man or one group of men try to deprive another man or another group of men of their role or identity as men. So this is kind of complicated, right? But this is basically where a group of men try to make other men not feel like men, try to make them feel like they are failing in their masculine performance, failing to uphold those traits that society associates with masculinity. So we'll talk about this a lot in terms of how white men in the antebellum South tried to emasculate enslaved men. That's where this concept will really become important, okay? So now that we've established some clear definitions, let's move on, and we're going to start with discussing enslaved masculinity. So there are tons of different masculine traits that we can associate with enslaved manhood. But given the parameters of time, right, I had to limit it to just the top three that I see most often in scholarship and that I see in primary sources. So we're going to talk about three different traits of enslaved masculinity: regaining bodily autonomy, exhibiting strength and bravery, and providing and protecting for loved ones. These are really important, all three of them. So let's start with regaining bodily autonomy. So we all know that in slavery, enslaved people as a whole are denied control over their bodies, right? Last week, we read the account from Harriet Ann Jacobs of atrocious events of sexual assault by her enslaver. So we definitely see this with enslaved women, but this also applies to enslaved men. Enslaved men also lacked control over their body, over what happened to it, over the work they did, right? They lacked control over their body or bodily autonomy. So with this in mind, part of enslaved manhood was the desire to regain that control, to regain that bodily autonomy. And in order to regain that bodily autonomy, it required masculine performance. One way in which this was done was through gambling and drinking. So in the antebellum South, gambling and drinking by enslaved people, including enslaved men, was illegal beyond the oversight of white authority. So some enslaved men, and this was often men, not women, for a variety of reasons that we can talk about, but enslaved men would go beyond the plantations to gamble and to drink And this is viewed by historians as a way for them to kind of regain control over their bodies and say, hey, I'm going to do with my body what I want to do with it, period. So this is a really important aspect of regaining bodily autonomy that we don't often think about. Another way that some enslaved men would try to regain bodily autonomy was through fighting or wrestling. So there are rare instances where enslaved men would actually fight white men. An example of this is Frederick Douglass, right, whose name we all know. Frederick Douglass, for a time, was hired out to a known slave breaker named Edward Covey. A slave breaker was someone who took an enslaved person who was not doing what they were supposed to, who was breaking social expectations, and would quite literally break them down by physically brutalizing them and beating them into submission. So Frederick Douglass was given to Edward Covey in order to be broken. And Douglass faced extreme brutality for 6 months until he finally fought back. And when he fought back, Douglass wrote in his autobiography that he felt his sense of manhood was reawakened because he had taken control over his body again and had beaten Covey in this fight. So here we have straight from Douglass this idea of how fighting contributes to bodily autonomy. But we also have to keep in mind that this fighting of enslaved people versus white people was rare, right? So let's acknowledge that. More often was enslaved men fighting other enslaved men. Now, oftentimes these fights or these wrestling matches were arranged by slave owners. So a slave owner from Plantation A would basically gamble with a slave owner from Plantation B that his slave could beat his slave. And they would gamble and they would bet money on it and they would try to gain a profit. So first we need to acknowledge that these wrestling matches that were bet on by slaveholders is just another way that they exploited the bodies of enslaved men. So we need to acknowledge that, the exploitativity of that, right? But we also need to look at the words of enslaved people themselves, because if we look at how enslaved people reacted to these wrestling matches, we see that they viewed these wrestling matches as a way to regain bodily autonomy, to prove physical control. They also saw that if they succeeded, if they won the wrestling match, they would gain great material gains from their enslavers. This might be more food, better housing, lighter work for themselves and their families. And so these enslaved people really recognized that although this was exploitative, right, and we need to acknowledge that, they also saw it as a way through which enslaved men could prove their manhood and could regain their bodily autonomy as a way to prove that manhood. So fighting is a really important aspect of this. Okay, so that's regaining bodily autonomy. Very important, major component of enslaved masculinity. So let's talk about the second one. The second one is exhibiting strength and bravery. So obviously, fighting was a way to exhibit strength and bravery as well. Obviously, physical strength, bravery, and just getting into that wrestling ring, right? So that's an example of strength and bravery, as well as regaining bodily autonomy. But there were other ways that they exhibited strength and bravery. And another way was through resistance. This could be large-scale resistance. This image shows Nat Turner working with his fellow enslaved rebels in the Virginia Rebellion that we read about last week. So there was large-scale form resistance, like leading insurrections. There were also small-scale forms of resistance that also proved strength and bravery. This might be feigning illness, breaking plantation tools, working slowly. All of these things took extreme bravery, because if an enslaved person was caught lying about illness or caught breaking plantation tools or caught working too slowly, they would certainly be punished. So this is definitely a component of proving that strength and bravery as an aspect of their feelings of manhood, a kind of way to regain control, right? That is what enslaved manhood kind of centers around, is this idea of regaining some degree of control, some degree of humanity in the horrible institution of slavery. Another way that enslaved men would prove strength and bravery, perhaps the largest way, is by evading slave patrols. So slave patrols were groups of white men who would patrol around the plantations, often at night, to ensure that no enslaved person was beyond the plantation's borders without a pass. These patrols were vicious. They could, quite frankly, do whatever they wanted if they found an enslaved person beyond the plantation, punish them however they saw fit. Now, enslaved people recognized the danger of these slave patrols, but they still went beyond the plantations. They still went beyond for that gambling, that drinking. They went beyond plantation borders for hunting to provide for their families, all the while acknowledging the risk that they faced. So that takes bravery, right? There's also some bravery and some strength in the way that they would fight back against slave patrols. So we actually have a legal case from Anderson, South Carolina, where 15 to 20 enslaved men were charged with chucking clubs and sticks at slave patrols that were pursuing them. So this is kind of a way of resisting slave patrols, right? That definitely took bravery. We also have quite a few cases that we see in court records in Virginia of enslaved men who would stretch grapevines across the roads so that when the slave patrollers came galloping in on their horses, they would trip, fall, and wouldn't be able to catch them. So this idea of evading slave patrols is a great example of how enslaved men exhibited strength and bravery. Okay, so let's talk about the final aspect of enslaved manhood for today, which is providing for and protecting loved ones. So the idea of providing for and protecting loved ones is still associated with masculinity today, right? The idea of a breadwinner. It's starting to slowly phase out, right? But it is very much still associated with manhood today. And it was back at this point as well, and it was for enslaved people. However, we have to recognize that it was often difficult for enslaved men to provide for and protect their loved ones because of the institution of slavery, because of family separation that we've talked about before, and I'll talk about more today, because of cross-plantation marriages, which is marrying someone who lives on a neighboring plantation, maybe 5 miles away, which doesn't sound like much, but they didn't have cars. They had to work sun up to sundown, so when will you get to see your wife and your kids, right? So there's all these different components that make providing for and protecting loved ones difficult because of the way slavery as an institution functioned. But despite this, enslaved men certainly prioritized providing for and protecting their families. These are a few ways in which they did that. Hunting was a major way that they provided for families because they contributed meat to their children's diets, which helped prevent malnourishment and starvation within their families. Another way that they would protect loved ones was by actually taking the physical punishments on behalf of their wife or their child. We have many accounts of enslaved men who would step in and take a punishment from an overseer or a slaveholder instead of watching his wife or his child be beat. So that's a very powerful way that they protected loved ones. And finally, we have this idea of ideological provision. Seems really vague, right? So ideological provision is basically the idea that enslaved men provided spiritually for their children. They provided them moral guidance. This might be through religion, right? We talked about Nat Turner being a preacher. This was common. There were enslaved people who were preachers. We also are talking about moral guidance, kind of the moral well-being to withstand the horrors of slavery. That is something that enslaved fathers would instill in their children. And the enslaved fathers who did instill those ideals in their kids were recognized as a very respected individual within the slave community because they were providing their child with that ideological strength. So we see here that the way in which enslaved men provided for their loved ones was both physical provision, material provision, as well as ideological provision. And both are equally important. And so we have to acknowledge both. Okay, so those are the 3 different traits of enslaved masculinity that we're going to talk about, right? Regaining bodily autonomy, exhibiting strength and bravery, and providing for and protecting loved ones. All 3 of these traits were prevalent across the South in enslaved communities. Of course, there are variations in terms of how much one aspect of this masculinity can be enacted versus another, right? If you're separated from your family, the idea of providing for and protecting loved ones might take a backseat to some of these other forms like exhibiting strength and bravery. So this is not a set scale, right? This is not a third of your manhood is linked to each aspect, right? it can fluctuate and it can change based on circumstances. But regardless, all three of these traits of enslaved manhood are evident throughout enslaved communities in the South in the 19th century, which is really important. And all of these traits of enslaved manhood are performed. They're proven to public, right? Through all the ways that I've talked about: illicit gambling and drinking, fighting, evading slave patrols, large forms of resistance, small forms of resistance, hunting, taking punishments for loved ones, ideological provision. All of these acts that I described are examples of masculine performance because they are enslaved men performing those masculine traits of regaining bodily autonomy, exhibiting strength and bravery, and providing for and protecting loved ones. So all of that are examples of masculine performance. Now, the main goal of this masculine performance was to overcome emasculation and prove manhood to your peers, right? So enslaved men recognized that a main reason why they were performing their manhood in all the ways I discussed is because they wanted to overcome emasculation that was caused by the institution of slavery and also prove to their peers that they're men. That was super important. So with that in mind, because slavery was constantly meant to detract from Black men's physical autonomy and their strength and their bravery and their ability to provide, this idea of masculine performance was very important. So many enslaved people recognized the importance of masculine performance, but also many Northern anti-slavery activists recognized the importance of masculine performance and tried to call on enslaved men to perform their masculinity in a way that embraced resistance to slavery as an institution. So I'll give you all two examples of this. One is David Walker. So David Walker wrote an appeal to the colored citizens of the world in 1829. And in this appeal, he makes a lot of appeals to enslaved men's sense of masculinity to urge them to rebel, to rise up in violent resistance against their enslavers. He says at one point, quote, "We are men and not brutes as we have been represented." This is very powerful, right? He's saying white society is depicting you as brutes, as unmanly beings. So you need to get up and prove to them that you are actually men. So he's one example. 14 years later, Henry Highland Garnett gave an address to the slaves of the United States in 1843. In this, he specifically played to enslaved men's desire to provide for loved ones as a way to be men. So we see in these two examples, right, how Black enslaved men recognized their emasculation because of slavery, recognized their desire to overcome that emasculation through masculine performance, and Black Northerners, Black anti-slavery activists acknowledged their desire to overcome emasculation and urged them to perform their masculinity in a resistant manner, in a way that would topple slavery as an institution. So this is really important, right? We see in all this discussion of enslaved manhood traits of enslaved masculine identity, how enslaved men performed masculinity, and how activists appealed to enslaved masculinity to get people to join their causes. All very important notions of enslaved manhood. Okay, so now we're going to move on. We're going to talk about white masculinity in the antebellum South. Once again, there are lots of different traits that we can associate with white manhood during this time, but we're going to focus on three, again, for the sake of time. So these three traits are dominance over dependence, independence, and protection of households and white women. All of these traits are very important, and they are commonly in scholarship that discusses white masculinity. Now, something to really keep in mind about white manhood as we go through these traits and how these traits were performed is that white masculinity was performed and embodied in a way to oppose Black manhood. So what I mean by that is white men made it their goal to embody the opposite of Black men. So if Black enslaved men were dependent, right, if they were reliant on slavery as an institution and negatively affected by slavery as an institution, then white men had to really emphasize independence to prove that they were the opposite of these emasculated, feminine Black men, as they labeled them. So that's a really important theme in this that you all will see, hopefully, is that for white men, they had to prove themselves as the complete opposite of Black men and Black manhood in the antebellum South. Okay, so with that general theme in mind, let's go ahead and talk about this first trait, which is dominance over dependence. So the first question is, who are these dependents? Basically, a white man's dependence in this time was defined as anyone except a white man. So you're talking enslaved men and women, you're talking white women, children, free African Americans in the South and in the North. All of these individuals were viewed as lower than white men, as subservient to white men, and thus as their dependents. So what this means that in white households, white men were expected to exercise complete dominance over these dependents. So one way in which they did this was extreme dominance over enslaved people in all the ways that we know, with controlling their labor, controlling who they married, controlling the legality or lack of legality of enslaved marriages. All of those were contributors to kind of exercising dominance over enslaved people as a dependent population. Another way that we've alluded to before is family separation, right? Family separation was a major weapon by slaveholders as a way to threaten enslaved people and beat them into submission without actually physically brutalizing them. Another way was through sexual violence. We saw this with Harriet Ann Robinson's piece Harriet Ann Jacobs' piece that we read before. And this is a really important piece because it shows us the horror of sexual violence in slavery, but we also need to acknowledge the prevalence. So historians now estimate that about 13% of enslaved people had white paternity. That would be 500,000 enslaved people by the time of the Civil War. So this is really important because this shows us how prevalent sexual violence is as an issue. And now some people may argue, well, some of those relationships could have been consensual between a slaveholder and an enslaved woman. But I would argue that the consent in that situation is not full consent because of the uneven power dynamic between a slaveholder and enslaved woman. So I would argue that even if the relationship was somewhat consensual, there is no such thing as full consent between a slaveholder and enslaved woman. That's something that I'm happy to talk about more later and that we can discuss and debate. But that's my personal views on the issue. So what this shows us, right, is how white men exercised dominance over enslaved people, both enslaved men and enslaved women, because the fact is that sexual violence affected enslaved men as well. Family separation affected enslaved men as well. So we should recognize that. There was also dominance, of course, over white society in terms of how much they prioritized kind of protecting white households and how that affected white women's lives. And we'll talk about that later. But it's really important to emphasize the importance of this dominance over dependence that white men really emphasized and prioritized in the antebellum South. Okay, so let's talk about the next component, which is this concept of independence. Independence is also very important. And as I alluded to before, it's rooted in slavery, right? If enslaved men and enslaved people are viewed as dependent, then white men had to be independent. They had to prove their independence. And there were two ways to do this. One way was by having dependents, owning enslaved people, hiring enslaved people, having a white wife and white children that you could be dominant over. That was one way to prove your independence. So in a sense, right, kind of white men's independence relied on the dependence of others. So there was this constant kind of fear that if they lost these dependent populations, like if slavery ended and they lost an enslaved population, white men's independence would come under threat. It would become very unsteady and they would have a hard time kind of re-solidifying it. That kind of argument that the precariousness of white men's independence and thus white men's manhood in the antebellum South will become a major argument amongst historians who view the Civil War as a crisis in white manhood. Another concept that we can talk about in greater detail if you all would like me to in questions afterwards. But there's another way that white men kind of proved their independence and maintained their independence. And this was through owning land. Owning land was very important amongst white men in the South. Of course, we know the giant plantations by these wealthy slaveholders, right? That's, of course, a way to own land. But it was also important amongst poor white men. So these white men who were small farm holders were called yeomen. That's how you spell it on the bottom, because I know it's a weird word. But so yeomen were poor white farm owners who often did not own slaves, but they did own land, and they would farm the land themselves. Their wife and their children would farm the land. Sometimes they would hire slaves from neighboring plantations to help them farm the land. But the basic concept here is that they had their own land. It was just a small farm. And to these men, owning that land was a big source of independence. And they really prioritized maintaining hold of that land. They did not want to lose that land because these men knew that if they lost that land, they would lose some of their independence. So with that in mind, these people often practiced a cautious household economy. What this means is that they grew food rather than growing cash crops like cotton and tobacco and indigo, right? They grew food for themselves. That way, they didn't have to rely on going to the market and buying food in order to avoid starvation in their families. So this cautious household economy really shows us the emphasis that these yeomen, these poor white men, put on land ownership because they linked it to independence, because they linked it to manhood. Okay, so that's dominance over dependence and independence. Now let's talk about this last concept, which is really big and really vague, right? Protection of white households and white women. What does that mean, right? It's a really vague idea, but it's so, so important to white manhood in the antebellum South. So basically, this idea of kind of protecting white households and white women relies on these two earlier traits of dominance over dependence and independence. Basically, if you, as the white man, are the dominant individual, the independent person, you are responsible for taking care of your dependents, taking care of your households, right? So this idea of kind of protecting white households and white women is rooted in these two previous ideas we discussed of dominance over dependence and independence. So one way in which white men viewed themselves as protecting white households was by preventing slave rebellion, because they viewed enslaved insurrections as a threat to white households. So they did this through slave patrols, right, that we talked about before. They did this through limiting enslaved education, which Maggie, I think, will talk about with us on Wednesday. They also did this by making examples out of rebels. So we all know that Nat Turner was executed, right? We read his account last week. But I want to give you all another example. So this is artist's depiction of the 1811 slave revolt led by Charles Deslandes in what was the territory of Louisiana. So Charles Deslandes led the slave revolt, often called the German Coast Uprising. He led enslaved people armed along the Mississippi River. The plan was to get to New Orleans and unite with the large free African-American population there and tear down slavery in the territory. Now, he was stopped. The territorial governor, William Charles Cole Claiborne, ordered the militia to come together. They brutally put down the rebellion. And what happened, and this is graphic, I won't show an image, but the description is graphic, is the leaders of the rebellion, many of the participants, were executed, and their heads were chopped off and put on stakes. And they lined the Mississippi River with these heads as a warning to enslaved people that if you rebelled, this is what was going to happen to you. This is a brutal example, but it is still an accurate example of how enslaved men tried to prevent enslaved insurrection or discourage enslaved insurrection by making an example out of rebels. So this was an important component of kind of preventing slave insurrection through making examples, limiting education of enslaved people, and using slave patrols. And all of these reasons, all of these efforts to prevent insurrection was rooted in this idea of protecting white households, protecting white society, because they believed that if slavery fell, white society as a whole would crumble and fall. And this idea was often rooted in justifications for slavery. So last week we read James Henry Hammond's religious justifications for slavery. So the Bible was one way. Another way that they justified slavery was through paternalist arguments, right? This idea of slavery is a positive good. So this political cartoon kind of shows you. So this enslaved person in this cartoon is saying, God bless you, master. You feed and clothe us. When we are sick, you nurse us. And when too old to work, you provide for us. And the slaveholder is saying, these poor creatures are a sacred legacy from my ancestors. And while $1 is left me, nothing shall be spared to increase their comfort and happiness. Now, we all know that paternalism is not true, right? Enslaved people were not treated well in the vast majority of cases. But these were arguments that were made. This was one justification for slavery. There were other justifications that enslavement was central to white society, right? This idea that William Harper expressed in 1838 in his publication entitled Slavery is the Cause of Civilization, right? It's right there in that title. Without slavery, there would be no civilized world. James Henry Hammond, who we read last week, also made an argument called the Mudsill argument in 1858. And this is the argument that every society needs a mudsill or a lowest class. And in the South, this was slaves. And without that mudsill, without slaves, all of society would crumble and fall apart because you need that. You need that foundation of a lowest class. Now, these arguments, of course, we know are horrible and racist and rooted in prejudice, but they were arguments that were made to continuously prop up slavery as an institution and protect white households because they viewed protecting slavery and protecting white society as protecting white households. All of these things were linked together and were very important to white men and were emphasized. And as we'll discuss soon, appeals were made to white men to make them realize how all these things were connected and how all these things, protecting slavery, protecting white households, protecting white women, were connected to protecting white manhood. Everything was connected in these arguments, which is so, so important. Another way that these white men would protect white women specifically, going beyond white households, is often through violence. So in South Carolina, a judge ruled in the 1840s that a white man was justified in assault and battery against an alleged assailant who was found to have assaulted the man's honor or insulted his wife. So here we have state-sanctioned violence for the idea of insult. And this is really important because this was an excuse that many white men used as a way to violently protect their white women. There's also another aspect of this protection of white women, which is reactions to consensual sexual relationships between white women and Black men. So we know that white men often sexually assaulted and violated Black women, especially enslaved women. These relationships were viewed by broader white society in the South, for the most part, as socially okay, because they reinforced the gender and the racial structure of the South. On the other hand, consensual sexual relationships between Black men and white women were unacceptable. And this was largely because white men believed it as kind of ruining this myth of white women's purity and their virtue, because they were being engaged romantically with a Black man. This idea is also rooted in the myth of Black over sexuality. this idea that Black men are over-sexual beings that are going to assault your wife and ruin her virtue. That's an argument that's made throughout the antebellum South as a reason why you should keep white women and Black men separate. It's also a justification and an excuse that you'll see in the post-Civil War era for mass lynchings during the Jim Crow era. So this kind of myth of Black over-sexuality is really rooted, at least in the antebellum era, if not earlier. And we can trace it back to this idea amongst white men that they had to protect white women, even if what they were protecting her from was a myth in the end. But it was still viewed as very important to them. Okay, so we've talked about all the traits of white manhood that I'm going to discuss today. Dominance over dependence, independence, and the protection of white households and the protection of white women, and how all of this is rooted in the institution of slavery. We also talked about how all these traits are performed, right? Controlling the household, maintaining property ownership, sexual violence against Black women, preventing slave rebellion, making examples out of enslaved rebels, justifying slavery, and restricting white women's relationships with Black men. All of these were ways that white men performed masculinity. And all of this is connected back to that idea introduced at the beginning of this section about white men trying to prove that they are the opposite of Black men. This is very important, right? This is the main goal of white masculine performance. Okay? With that in mind, now I want us to kind of turn to think about the way that Southern institutions reinforced white manhood and how they did so often at the expense of Black men. So we'll talk about two types of Southern institutions. We'll talk about religion and we'll talk about the law. And I've kind of alluded to both previously, but we're going to dive in a little deeper. So religion. The church reinforced these ideas and these performances of white manhood in two big ways. First, church leadership was often completely male. You'll see that in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's readings this week. She talks about how the clergy doesn't support women's rights. You'll see that in her reading. And part of that is linked to the fact that church leadership was entirely white and entirely male in the vast majority of Southern white churches. Another way that the church reinforced white men and white manhood was through the words of reverends themselves and preachers. One example for you is Reverend Howe. He was a reverend in South Carolina, and he made the argument in 1850 that women were never meant to, quote, rule with the hand of power. And if a woman spoke in public on behalf of abolition or women's rights, she would become, quote, disgusting and unlovely as she assumes to be a man. Here we have a clear example of a reverend kind of reinforcing this idea of white men's dominance over women, of women's subservient space in society, right? All these ideas are really expressed by Reverend Howe just in this statement alone. The law is another powerful indicator of and supporter of white men's dominance. This can be seen in divorce laws. This is a picture of North Carolina Chief Justice Richmond Mumford Pearson. He ruled against allowing a woman a divorce after she had been horribly brutalized by her husband for years, because he decided that, quote, the law gives the husband power to use such degree of force necessary to make the wife behave and know her place. The divorce was denied, like I said. So this is one example of how the law kind of reinforced white men's dominance over white women specifically, based off divorce laws. The law also reinforced white men's dominance over African American men. In 1819, the Virginia legislature upheld castration as the appropriate punishment for any enslaved man convicted of an attempted ravishing or sexual assault of a white woman. There was no similar punishment for a white man in the state, let alone in the nation. In Arkansas, the Supreme Court ruled in the 1820s that it was acceptable for African Americans to receive a harsher punishment than white men for the same crime. So this kind of shows you how the law in the antebellum South was constantly reinforcing white men's dominance over both white women and over African Americans, whether enslaved or free. We also, of course, have laws against slave education that reinforced this and are also very important, but I will leave that to Maggie to talk about on Wednesday. So clearly, religion and law supported white manhood, often at the expense of Black men. White women, however, were also often important supporters of white manhood. Southern women often blatantly advocated for women's continued subservient position. Louisa Susanna Chavez McCord is an example of this. She's from a wealthy family from Charleston, South Carolina. She wrote poetry. In one of her poems, she said that women should, quote, kneel to nature's inborn majesty in man. She was a clear supporter of white women's subservient position. Another example is Virginia Randolph Carey. She wrote letters on female character, which encouraged women to be submissive, arguing, quote, a state of subordination is ordained by heavenly wisdom. Here again, we have a religious justification, not only for slavery, but for women's subservience. Now we need to recognize, right, not all white women, of course, advocated for women's ongoing subservience. There were those women's rights activists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, like we mentioned before, right? But these are two examples of elite women who did advocate for women's ongoing subservience and thus white men's ongoing dominance, which is important for us to think about. Okay, so we know the traits of white masculine identity. We know the role of institutions like religion, law, and the role of white women. Now we have to consider how white men were called to prove white manhood. So we talked about how enslaved men were called to violently resist slavery as an institution, as a way to prove manhood. But white men were also appealed to through calls to gain more dependence. That was a way that they could prove their manhood, like I mentioned before. Defend their honor and their wife's honor, that was another way. But most importantly, this idea of maintaining the status quo, the idea of continuously promoting the number one Southern institution that white society and white manhood relied on in the antebellum South, slavery. So oftentimes, to give you all some examples of this, wealthy planters were concerned that non-slaveholders would not support slavery to the same degree because they did not see the same immediate benefits of slavery that slaveholders received with wealth and power and control. So some would try to argue to non-slaveholders that their manhood was reliant upon the continuance of slavery. James D.B. DeBow was one person who did this in 1861 when the Southern states were considering secession. He argued that slavery was the only way for white men to preserve their independent and dominant status as men. So they must secede if they want to maintain independent and dominant. So that's one example from him. Another earlier example, in South Carolina specifically, is the nullification crisis. So we talked about last week this idea of tariffs and how the South didn't like tariffs. The nullification crisis is an extreme example of this. So we know the South grew raw materials like cotton, shipped it to England. England made textiles, clothes, and shipped it to the North. The North would buy English textiles. So kind of think of it as a triangle, right? So the South feared that tariffs on imported foreign goods, like from England, would make those goods so expensive that England wouldn't want the South's raw cotton anymore, which would hurt Southern business, Southern economy. So the South, especially South Carolina, argued against these tariffs that were implemented. They argued that they favored the North at the expense of the South and that they should be done away with. In 1832, South Carolina passed the Ordinance of Nullification, where they basically said, forget you, federal government. We're not listening to that. We're just going to ignore it because that's our right. In these arguments in South Carolina to try to get men to support nullification, they made specific appeals to white manhood. Robert Barnwell Rhett made a speech in Walterboro, South Carolina, in which he said the tariff was, quote, an infringement on our privileges as men, and that true men would not allow themselves to become crushed and trampled slaves. So this is a clear appeal to white men's independence and their opposition, their opposite status of enslaved people. The governor at the time, James Hamilton, also argued that fighting the tariff was critical to protect a white man's wife and children, who, quote, the love of manhood has made us swear to protect. Clear appeal to the idea of protecting white households and white women. So this really shows us how white slaveholders and white politicians would appeal to white men's desire to prove themselves the opposite of enslaved men and prove that they were men in order to get them to support these major causes like the continuation of slavery, like succession, like the nullification crisis. Okay, we covered a lot of ground today, so let's just review. So there are three main traits of enslaved masculinity: regaining bodily autonomy, exhibiting strength and bravery, and providing for and protecting loved ones. Three traits of white masculinity: dominance over dependence, independence, and protecting white households and white women. The main goal of enslaved masculine performance was to overcome emasculation, while the main goal of white masculine performance was to avoid emasculation and prove yourself the opposite of Black men. Enslaved manhood relied on regaining control over yourself and lacked the help of Southern institutions. White manhood relied on maintaining dominance and control over others and had the help of Southern institutions. Despite these differences, they were also similar in that both white men and enslaved men performed manhood. Both encountered appeals to their sense of manhood to draw support for certain causes, and both prioritized protection and providing of loved ones. So that was a lot of information today, but I hope you have a better understanding of how this idea of Southern manhood plays a role in major historical events in the antebellum South, because this is so important. And by looking at Southern history through a gendered lens, we really gain a deeper understanding of what is happening in the South as we approach the Civil War. And as we enter the Civil War, this is a really important part of the story. So I hope this gave you a deeper understanding. For those of you who are watching at home because you couldn't come to class, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. My email's on the syllabus. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Other than that, I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Okay? Bye.